Good afternoon. My name is Michael Snyder. I grew up in Baltimore. I live down in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm 100% Ashkenazi Jew. I've been doing genealogy for probably about 12 years. And when I heard that there was going to be a conference in Poland for the International Association of Jewish Genealogy Societies, I thought that would be a great opportunity to be able to go to Eastern Europe and visit some of the ancestral homes where I've been researching and get a bit of a feel for what things were like there. Every year, as part of my genealogy experience, I send out a letter to my extended family, letting them know about the research that I found over the last year. So in this last January, I sent a letter and told everyone I would be probably going to the conference and invited others to come along and join me if they would like. This is a copy of my maternal grandmother's family. Name is Gouline and Oaks, and they are from Ukraine, from the Gouline area of Ukraine. When I first started researching this part of my family, they thought they were from Minsk or Pinsk or somewhere up in Belarus. But in actuality, I discovered that they were from Gouline, and this is the one of the first locations that I wanted to be able to visit. Now, one of the interesting things that my mother shared with me was that her mother always told her that she was not Galiciana, so she was not from the part of Ukraine and Poland that were in the Far East, but they were in the area, they were somewhere else. And my discovery of Gouline and my research within Gouline has led to that particular fact. My mother's grandfather, whose name is Highstein, actually changed his name from Khait. Max Highstein, who was the first generation to come to the United States, and he came with his son, my grandfather, when he was 8 years old, actually started a tavern in downtown Baltimore. And the theory we have is that he changed his name from Khait to Highstein to be able to make it sound more Germanic, which hopefully opened him up to a larger clientele. It was believed that the German Jews were not as welcoming to Eastern European Jews at the time that he came to the United States. Most of this tree I inherited from, or part of this tree I inherited from a couple of my cousins, and over time I've extended it to go out to the 1720s. This is my maternal grandfather's mother's tree. Her name was Celia Kreiger, and she's descended from Zusman and Zaidel Kreiger. A lot of this information I got from a cousin, who her name is Elad Gordon Leviton. She has an extensive website on the internet that has added a lot of information. This part of my tree actually overlaps with some of my grandfather's father's tree. A lot of them came from Pasvagius district of Ukraine. This here is my father's family. I've only very recently found additional information on my father's family. His name is Snyder. Snyder is a very popular name. I knew that he came from Pasvatine, my grandfather, Isaac. He came here when he was about 16. And he met my grandmother here. My grandmother is a Bass, another very popular name. So it made it hard for me to do some research my grandmother, Lena Bass. Story is she came here from Lithuania through a arranged marriage. Her parents had already moved here and lived in Louisville, Kentucky, and they'd arranged for her to marry a cousin. But when she got off the ship in Baltimore, she says, "I'm not doing that." And she stayed in Baltimore and ultimately married my grandfather, Mike Snyder, who I'm named for. Over the last year, I've actually found some additional information about her, and she comes from her at least her maternal family comes from a line called Musicant, and they're from Papanea and Canis, which actually overlaps with a lot of the other locations that I have on my mother's side. So when I started planning my trip, my sister decided she would join me, as well as my cousin Wendy, who actually had done some genealogy, and we were all very excited. And we reached out to a lot of different tour guides to be able to find out some information about how we could actually tour this part of Ukraine and ultimately Lithuania. I reached out to tour guides. They gave me some estimates, and ultimately decided on one who actually did some genealogy tours, and she did some research for us in addition. And we were quite happy with the tour that she set up. But the sites that I wanted to visit, the 4 sites were where I have ancestral family, which were Kremenets, Lutsk, Radivlev, and Rivne. And they're all right here in an area that's part of Gouline. And here's the historical location for Gouline, which at some point in time was like an independent country, but ultimately became part of Belarus and Poland and Lithuania and moved around a lot. But that's the area that I was interested in exploring. Here is Lithuania, and there were 9 sites that I wanted to be able to visit here. This is where I had family in each of these different towns, cities, shtetls. Wasn't sure what they looked like, but figured I'd like to visit them all and get a feel for what they were like. When we ultimately planned our tour, we decided on an 18-day trip. Spent the first 4 days in Poland for the conference. Then we traveled to Ukraine for about 4 or 5 days, and then Lithuania for about 9 days, as there were twice as many sites in Lithuania as I wanted to visit as there were in Ukraine. The tour guides did all a lot of the planning. They arranged for the hotels or made recommendations for hotels. They did the driving. They did the interpreting, and they did some advanced research to be able to make sure that we could find the various locations that we wanted to visit. And just so you have a better feel for Lithuania and where my family is from, you can see the Nemesis River, which runs longest river in Lithuania. It runs through and by Canis, and it runs to the Baltic Sea over here. This is Vilnius, where we flew into. And then you can see most of my family are from the central region of Lithuania, which actually is between Canis and Riga, and Riga's on the Baltic. And the trade routes from Vilnius and Canis both ran through this particular region. Here's some pictures that I had from my earlier research. Here's a family picture from children here's some picture from the Khait family, which were descendants from of my grandfather on my mother's side. Here's another picture of a grave site in Berja, which I wanted to visit. Here's my grandmother Cecilia Highstein. Her original name was Kreiger, and she's who my mother was named after. This is a town square in Pasvatine, which is where my grandfather came from. This is a synagogue in Lutsk, where my maternal grandmother, I believe, was born. And here's a synagogue in Pasvalos that we actually went to visit. Now, the interesting thing that you need to know, or I needed to know, and I was so happy to learn about, was the history of Jews in Eastern Europe. And the history of Jews in Eastern Europe was pretty much led by the Poles. So the Polish nobles invited Jews to come into Poland and be able to live among them as the middle class. And as the Polish Empire expanded, the Jews expanded in Eastern Europe, and as it contracted, they were left behind to deal with the people who were left, who were native to that particular area. In 1635, which is the time that the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth existed, and that was the largest extent of Poland. You can see here down at the bottom is where my Ukrainian family is from, and then here's Lithuania, and where the Lithuanian, you can see where my Lithuanian roots come from, and they're all part of that Polish Empire. In 1772, the size of Poland contracted as the Prussians invaded, and the Austrians, or the Habsburg Empire, took over parts of Poland, and it contracted again as Russia took over various aspects of the Polish Empire. But you can see still that in 1793, which is about the earliest time my family, they were still part of Poland. And that's where I found a lot of my research was in the Lithuanian and Polish archives. And ultimately, around 1795, Poland completely ceased to exist and was split up between the Russians and the Prussians and the Austrians. And my family actually was living in Russia, and this part of Russia is called the Pale. And Jews were allowed to live in the Pale, but they were not allowed to travel to the eastern parts of Russia. Eventually, parts of Poland came back as the Duchy of Warsaw, which is when Napoleon invaded that area. Still, my family's part of Russia. That ultimately became the Congress of Poland. My family's still in Russia. Russia invaded and took over in 1846. And you can see that my family's still part of Russia. But you can see the Austrian Empire is still over here. It took over for the Habsburg Empire. And we're still right here on the border. This is important to understand, is because this town right here is right on the border, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Ultimately, during World War I, the Austrians and the Germans invaded, and Russia lost control over these lands. And then at the end of the war, it was split up, and Poland was created, Lithuania was created. And as you can see, my family still is here, part of the kind of disputed areas between Poland and Russia. And ultimately in 1920, Poland was recreated. And then the USSR, the war for when the communists actually took over the USSR, my family ended up as part of the USSR and independent countries here in Lithuania, is where my family is. And then in 1940, treaty between the Germans and the Russians, the Baltic states became part of the USSR. And then, as we know, in World War II, the Germans invaded and got pretty far into Russia and exterminated most of the Jews until 1945, when Poland was reconstituted. And then in 1991, when the end of the formal end of communism, and we ended up with the new countries of Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Estonia, and here again, my ancestral homes are in Ukraine and Lithuania, but as we saw earlier, they were actually part of Russia at one time and Poland before that. So now let's talk about my trip. So here's what I wanted to visit in Ukraine. My goal was to visit all of these towns in Gouline. You can see I took a fair number of pictures. In Ukraine, my sister took a lot of pictures as well, and you can see now that things are getting into color. Previous slides were pretty much black and white, and we're going to start my genealogy tour in Radivlev, which is right on the border of Volyn and Galicia, and Brody was in Galicia, which was part of the Habsburg Empire, and Radivlev was in, for the most part, Russia, which was the Russian Empire, and there was trade that went on here. So I figured my family was probably involved in trade between these two towns. They were only about 6 miles apart, so I did actually visit both of them to get a nice feel for what they were like and what trade was like when my family lived there in the 17 to 1800s. Radivlev, I had 3 generations of family, the Oaks and the Gertsbergs, which is my mother's side of the family, my mother's side of the family from 1700 to 1850. Radivlev was a small little town. Brody, which is the neighboring city, was a lot bigger. When we visited Radivlev, we saw that they're still using horse and carts to be able to get around. Here's my sister. We went and visited a Orthodox church, and in order to go to the Orthodox church, you had to cover your head and wear a skirt. So I actually saw what she looked like as a babushka. Here's the town square, and here's one of the buildings that was identified as having been a Jewish home within Radivlev. Radivlev ultimately, when the Soviets took over, actually was renamed to the town of the Soviet Army. And then after the Soviet Union fell, it became Radivlev again. Here's the cemetery in Radivlev. If you can see, the stones are all knocked over. It's overgrown. There's a monument there in the middle. This was the first cemetery that we visited where I actually had family. It was highly emotional to know that I had 3 generations of family buried in this cemetery, and really couldn't find their stones, but I knew they were here, and the cemetery was not taken care of. And it was kind of a highly emotionally difficult first part of the trip. The nice thing was there was a park bench right there, and we sat in it, and we could look up and see I think these were similar to aspens. You could hear the leaves rustling. There was a playground nearby where kids were playing. But it was a hard part of the first part of our journey, but it got worse. We wanted to go and find the Nazi killing site for Radovlev. Here's one of the roads that we went down. We talked to, our guide talked to a number of the locals to be able to find out where the site was. We didn't have a lot of good information about where it physically was. It was back in the woods. We ultimately talked to a gentleman who told us, continue down this road for a spell, and eventually you'll find a place to walk to the left, and you'll see a clearing there. He said it was about a kilometer back. So we drove back a kilometer, and we drove and drove and drove, and we couldn't find it. So we turned around, went back. We asked him if he could come and escort us there, and he took us, and apparently we had taken a turn and didn't realize it. And then ultimately we saw this clearing over here, not before encountering a broken down horse and cart. It was back in the woods, and this is kind of the pit where they buried, or where they shot and left the bodies and buried them. That pit's still there. It's back in the woods. There was a monument that was put up by the Soviets to honor the Jews, or not actually, to honor the Soviet citizens who had died there. There were 3,000 Jews from Radovlev that were murdered by the Nazis on October 5th, 1942. Ultimately, the Israelis came along and built a larger monument for the folks of Radovlev. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is Brody, which is the neighboring site, get a feel for what that was like. Brody was a much bigger, larger town. It was on the Habsburg Empire. Here's in the bottom left-hand corner is the synagogue. You can see that they've actually got a shopping district. There's two market squares, one on the on one end of the this road here, which is the older one, and one farther down close to this building here, which was a learning center, which was established initially by the Jews of Brody, and ultimately was turned over to the Ukrainians who lived in the area, and they continued to keep it as a place for education. We visited the cemetery in Brody. You can see that the stones are upright, in a lot better condition. There were, from our estimate, at least three, actually the rows of them are marked. There were 300 rows of headstones. We counted close to 50 headstones in each row, which meant there were about 15,000 people buried here over 250 years. The killing site for Brody was actually right next to the cemetery. It wasn't easy to get to. We had to go, through a lot of weeds and briars and things like that to be able to get there. This site, this memorial recognizes the 15,000 Jews that were killed in 3 days by the Nazis in Brody. So we've got an interesting juxtaposition of 15,000 people who had been buried in the cemetery over 250 years, and then an equal 15,000 people who were killed by the Nazis in 3 days. This was another difficult and emotional but part of my trip. So next place we're going to go and visit is Kremenets. Here's Radovlev, which is on the border, and if we head east, we come to Kremenets. We did stop at this a Ukrainian, actually it was a Russian Orthodox church. Amazing place to see, but I'm going to concentrate on the Jewish sites. So Kremenets is down here along the pre-Carpathian mountains, so it's a little bit hillier. And as you can see here, these are the mountains, and this is in a little valley. And when we went to the top of the valley, top of the mountain, where they had the castle, you can look down and see in the valley the entire city of Kremenets. I'll call it a large town. And if you look here, this is an area of education, and right here is kind of a big park. Well, this area used to be the Jewish ghetto, which is where they gathered all the Jews from the town, which is about 60% Jewish, before they were exterminated. And the Soviets built in this park a nice little, we called the Kremenets Eye. It's a Soviet era Ferris wheel, but there's not a lot left from the ghetto, which was also the area where most of the folks left, but they've left a lot of the roads there, and it's turned into a park, and people have these walking trails, which are the old streets of the Jewish part of the city of Kremenets. There's one Jewish building that's standing, and it's now a children's library in the middle of the park. Kremenets had a cemetery, and the cemetery was on a hill, so it survived a lot better than the one in Radovlev. My got family who's buried here. It has not been indexed, as you can see. It's quite overgrown. There's apple trees growing there. There's apple trees growing everywhere. The headstones you can see are obscured by weeds. I spent some time walking around, got my legs all torn up, but it was I guess it was an important experience for me to go through and do. One of the things I did, there were snails everywhere. So I picked up an old snail shell and brought it home with me, and I put it on my great-grandmother's headstone or footstone, and left it there for a little remembrance. I also, throughout the rest of my trip, picked up stones from other towns, which I got with me, which I'm going to be dropping off at other relatives. Kremenets had a nice little museum, and they did have an area that was dedicated to the Jews of Kremenets, and they showed a lot of old pictures. And then here's some genealogy metrical books that they had there, as well as the prayer books from the old synagogue, and there was a real nice poem that was there. Not going to read it for you this time, try and preserve some type, but it was a nice tribute to the Jews of Kremenets and how a local, actually did miss the Jews once they were gone. Here's the memorial site for the Jews that were killed in Kremenets. There were 15,000 that were killed here. What they did was they concentrated them in that ghetto for about a year, and then after about a year, they took them to this site. They had dug this huge long trench. You can see those trees. The trees were ultimately grew along the side of that trench, and they had this old memorial here that was put up by the Soviets, and ultimately the Israelis came back and built this other monument to the Jews that are there. So the next site we wanted to visit was Rivne. Rivne was a larger city in Ukraine. And a lot of the research that I collected came out of Rivne, because Kremenets was associated with the Rivne district at some point in time. So that's where I got some research. So I thought I'd go there and just check it out. I know that my family probably went there, and when I did research on the folks of Rivne, I did find that there were oaks and Gertsbergs and Shkurniks and actually Galons. So I believe that some, not necessarily my ancestors, but some of their cousins and whatever lived in Rivne. It's really and you can see here where the cemetery was, and the killing site is over here. We went and met with Vicky Chumskit. I'm totally with Victoria, who I'd actually been conversing with on Facebook. She's part of one of the groups that does research in the Gouline area. She is not Jewish, but she is a manager of the synagogue in Rivne. There's a small number of families that still live in Rivne, but nowhere near the 38,000 Jews that used to live there. Visited the killing site here. There were about 45 of these memorials, which listed names of folks that were documented. It's by far not the total number of folks that were actually exterminated. The memorials say there were 17,000. Victoria's research says there's probably more like 38,000 that were murdered. I found 28 people with my family surnames in Rivne. On the way to our next site, which is Lutsk, Diana, who's our tour guide, suggested we visit the Tunnel of Love. It's an old railroad. It's a railroad track, has trees growing over it. There was a movie made about it, and very popular with the folks from Japan. So we saw a lot of Japanese people there. Here's me and my sister. This was what we thought would be a light part of the trip, and we had a little bit of fun here. And as we were heading back to the car, we found another killing site, and this is where 1,500 folks from this part of Klevin, Ukraine, just outside of Rivne, were murdered. Next stop is Lutsk, which is where my grandmother was born. Just before they came to the United States, and I'm going to guess this is probably where my grandmother came from. I spent a half a day. This is Diana, who's our guide, at the archives in Lutsk, doing some research. Lutsk is very tight on holding information about sharing information with either the Mormons or Jewish Gen. So you really have to go there and get the documents. I would have liked to have spent more time, but they closed at 1 o'clock. Here I found an Abraham Gouline, who I'm hoping is an ancestor on my grandmother's father's side, who I don't have a lot of information about. This castle here is the castle of Lutsk. It was called the High Castle, and this over here was called the Low Castle, which is actually a synagogue in Lutsk. Lutsk also had a working community center where they actually hold services, and they've got some real nice stained glass windows in their, I'm going to call it their meeting hall, but it was probably also used as a sanctuary. And when we were there, they were prepping for Rosh Hashanah. The other thing we got to do when we were in Lutsk is we went on a boat ride tour down the Styr. It was pretty beautiful. People were picnicking on the sides of the banks. They were fishing. It was definitely a real enjoyable time on our trip. Got a nice feel for what the town was. They just started this river tour just this year, and it was fun part of it. But of course, we got to go and find the killing site for Lutsk. It was on the way to Lviv, where we were flying out to head to Lithuania. There were 25,000 people who were killed here in Lutsk. Includes 40 possible relatives, 35 Oaks, 3 Galons, 2 Shkurniks that I know of. This is what my sister said. She still had trouble, wrapping her head around, the what the Nazis did to our people. We got a chance to walk the towns and walk through the cities. But there really weren't a lot of Jews around. The numbers are staggering because, a lot of these towns were anywhere from 40 to 60, and some of the ones in Lithuania were 80% Jewish, and, there's hardly a soul left. But even though this trip was supposed to be about my ancestors who all left well before the war, there were lots of cousins and family that were left behind. And just to give you an idea of the Nazi invasion and how quickly this actually happened, in 41, the Nazis invaded Kremenets and Lutsk and Radovlev and Rivne, where they immediately killed 3,000 Jews. The Lutsk Jews were killed on July 4th. 3,000 were killed. In Rivne, 25,000 were also killed in August. 33,000 died at Baba Yar. I'm sure we We've heard about that in Kiev. I just want to put that into context. The Kremenets ghetto was established in August. 17,000 Lutz Jews were killed in August. In November, 17 to 39,000 Jews in Rivne were killed. And then in 42, like I said, about a year later, the Kremenets ghetto, everybody was exterminated there, 15,000. The ghetto was burned down. And then the last of my family members, 3,000 were killed in Radovlev in October of 42, which was that first killing site that we visited. So let me tell you, it wasn't just visiting sites, but eating food. It's amazing. The food of Eastern Europe is the food of the Jews. It's not Jewish food, it's Eastern European food. We had latkes, we had borscht, we had pickles, we had great bread, we had great cheeses and meats. And that one right in the center is gefilte fish, and that's a horseradish and beet mixture that it's served with. And it was the best gefilte fish that I ever had. So even though our tour was depressing in some ways, we ate quite well. In Ukraine and also Lithuania and Poland, there's still some anti-Semitism going on and some things that just concerned me. Here in Lviv, there's a gallows with a Jewish star defacing some of the Yiddish signs that still exist in that particular town. We went to a Jewish-themed restaurant, which I found quite disturbing. There were no prices on the menu. You had to negotiate for the price of your meal. My sister found it amusing. I found it depressing. There were souvenirs that, depicted Jews in a stereotypical fashion. When I went to the museum in Poland, I found this eraser, and it just struck me funny that they should be selling a Jew eraser. And then you find signs of people, and this is a sign that said, Shalom Aleichem, slept here. So now we'll go into Lithuania. We flew into Vilnius, and we were going to visit the towns of my ancestors in Lithuania. Here again, took a lot of pictures. I took, like I said, close to 2,000 pictures. My sister probably took as many, but these are all the different places that we visited. Between the two countries, we probably visited 30 different towns. So we're going to start our journey in Berzha, which is up in the north. It was the primary trade stopping point between Vilnius down here and Riga, which is up in the top. This is where my grandpa Charles was born, which my sister was named for. And it was a nice little town with lots of lakes. And just so you know, this is a typical Jewish building. A lot of the Jewish houses that were also shops had these cut corners. There's a couple of different theories about it. Our guide said that it was because you didn't ever want to turn your back on somebody as you were rounding a corner. So by having that as a gentle slope, you didn't do that sort of thing. But the Jewish sites usually had an entranceway that was catty corner so people could get to it from either street. And then they like to have their entrances open to people so that they were in the front of the building. Some of the locals, they tended to put their front entrance on the side of the building. So that's how you could tell the difference between a Jewish built building and a one of the other folks. So Berja, where my grandfather came from, his name was Khait, changed to Highstein, and then his wife was a Kreiger. Berja has a brewery, and we went and had dinner at the brewery there. It's got a lot of lakes, and lakes are caused because there's a lot of sinkholes, and there's sinkholes because there's a lot of lime deposits. So there's actually some caves and things like that. So we went and explored that a little bit. But before we actually explored the town, like I said, we had dinner the night before, but we didn't really explore the town. I went for a walk in the morning. I went to walk on most mornings, and I decided I'd do the 6 miles to get to the town and then back again. I walked past farming communities and interesting buildings. I found the market square, which is where a lot of the commerce took place, and found a number of interesting buildings that, from what my research had told me, were probably Jewish, and saw this building here. I believe this is an apple tree. I picked an apple off the tree, sat and ate it, and looked off at the river, which is right here, and just took a break on my walk. It was about the midway point, and just contemplated what it would be like to live in this little town with a little river that's running through it and the bridges that go underneath. And I saw some people fishing, and it was a nice little walk. The interesting thing is when I came back and we did the formal tour with the guide, it ended up that this building here, where I got the apple from, was the synagogue, and the building right next door was the Hasidic synagogue at the time. And it's just kind of eerie that I should pick an apple off a tree at the synagogue in Berja, where my grandfather was born. Some other locations in Berja, like I said, here's the synagogue, here's the river, this is the site where I sat and ate my apple. This is one of the buildings, which is probably a shop, and who knows, it could have been the shop where my grandfather had a business. Like I said, he went and opened a tavern. He probably learned about spirits from either working in the factory, or his parents may have had a tavern, but it gets pretty interesting. The other eerie thing is we went to look for the cemetery, and as we're looking for the cemetery, we walked through some people's backyards because that's where somebody told us to find the cemetery. I looked up, and this house looks exactly like my uncle's house in Baltimore. And I was struck by, and he did a lot of landscaping. It was just kind of really eerie that I should see a house that looked just like my uncle's house. He was my mother's brother. We continued on behind their house. 2 houses over is where we found the cemetery. Cemetery was in okay shape. It is kind of overgrown. It's hard to tell how high some of that vegetation is, but the stones were in Hebrew. Actually, I had somebody look at them, and they were Yiddish. It was hard without having somebody who translated Yiddish. It was hard to do that, but it's a site that maybe I'll go back to at some point in time and maybe do some research to see if I can find my great-great-grandfather and his family who are buried here. The cemetery was pretty big, lots of trees, vast area. In one corner of the cemetery, there was a memorial to the Holocaust victims. There were 90 who were killed at the cemetery when the Nazis first invaded Berja. And we later on found the marker on the road and this monument to the 2,500 people in Berja who were killed by the Nazis. And then supposedly sometime this month, they're supposed to have been dedicating a larger memorial to the folks in Berja. I don't know if that was completed yet. I hadn't seen any sign of them building this monument, but when I go back, I hope to be able to visit it. Just to get a feel for the Nazi invasion of Lithuania, here again, in June 91, they invaded most of the towns where my family comes from, a few of them. Then they started to build the ghettos in Lithuania. They did more ghettos, and they brought people from different areas together to be able to keep them concentrated before they were exterminated. And I'm not going to go into the details here because we'll cover that a little bit later. After Berja, we went to Pompeii. Pompeii is where I have 11 great-great-grandparents from. There was not a lot in Pompeii. We went and talked to the local pastor who was there. It's a real small town. They did have a mill, which was built by the Jews, and they had a few Jewish buildings standing, but it was a very, very small town. So until I do some research, I'm not really going to be able to find out much more about Pompeii. But they did have a cemetery and a killing site where 4,000 people had died. The cemetery here was a little bit better shaped than most, and it was a lot easier to find. After Pompeii, I want to cover the towns of Pasvatine, Linkova, and Vashki. Vashki and Linkova were kind of joint towns. Vashki was a shtetl, Linkova was a larger town. Pasvatine is where my father's side of the family came from. So they're there's about less than 10 kilometers apart, which was quite surprising. This whole area was prone to wildfires. And in 1902, there was a major wildfire in Pasvatine. I believe that's the same time that my great-great-grandfather passed away. I don't know if he died in the fire or if he died about the same time as the fire. But after that, the family was when the family moved to the States. And the Linkova, they had a major fire in 1883. That's when I believe some of the family moved to Berja, although others moved back to another town, Vashki, not Vashki, but Varnius. which I'll talk about a little bit later. Linkova, where the Khaits, Kreigers, and Shenkers are from. Like I said, they were here before they went to Berja. Here's a nice picture of me and my sister in front of the Linkova sign. This is the market square in Linkova. That picture that I showed you much earlier is with the horses, and you can see the same market building is there, what it looks like now, what it looked like in the 1800s. And then when we were in Linkova, we found this. We found the synagogue. The synagogue was built after the fire. It was built in 5650, which is 1890. I believe the fire was 1883, but it's still standing. Unfortunately, it's used as a storage building. We had a woman come up and ask us if we were going to renovate the building. Wasn't something that's I have in my pocketbook, but maybe eventually some people will come along and do some work on this particular building. Linkova and Vashki there were two cemeteries. Here's the cemeteries there. I know that there's Khaits and Kreigers and Shenkers that are buried here. It's in okay shape. It would be nice to be able to do a better job of taking care of it. The one in Vashki was better cared for than the one in Linkova. Pasvatine, this is my father's side of the family. My grandfather Mike was born in Pasvatine. I'm named for him. This is where the Snyders were from. Like I said, who knew that my father and mother came from the same county in Lithuania. This is a mill in Pasvatine. It was built also by the Jews. It was later used by the Soviets as a prison. You can see there's some Jewish buildings that are here in Pasvatine. We actually talked to the man who lived here. He says he really likes living in a Jewish-built house. It's quite sturdy and well constructed. Thank you. They visited the cemetery in Pasvatine. It was quite striking that all the headstones or most of them were all tilted in the same direction, like a big windstorm came through there. I don't know what caused it to do that. Maybe it was just the ground got soft and they all kind of lean the same way. This one was very well taken care of. It's right next to a farmer's property, and it looks like the farmer is actually taking care to keep the weeds down in this particular cemetery. So that's quite encouraging. And here's some of the headstones and the entrance marker to this particular cemetery. During our tour, we visited Pakarozha synagogue. It's one of the few standing wooden synagogues in Lithuania. They refurbished it. They repainted the inside. It looks really nice and inviting. And my sister asked if they held services there, and they said, well, there's no Jews. So much for that. Our next stop was Kaunas, which is the second biggest city in Lithuania. I did get an opportunity to go for a walk here. It was a nice place. Here's the city along the Nemunas River. I believe my Babylina Bass was born in Kaunas, I believe. There's a lot of monuments to the ghetto resistance in Kaunas. It was probably the largest ghetto in Lithuania, and probably the largest ghetto in Eastern Europe anywhere. It was larger than the ghetto in Poland when they put it together. And Jews there were a lot of. Kaunas was probably 80% Jewish, if I remember myself. But so there's a lot of Jewish history in Kaunas. And then here is a monument to at the killing site in Kaunas. This is a huge monument. You see this little speck here. This is me standing by the monument. It was a wonderful testament to the Jews of Kaunas. Here's a wall, and it's still riddled with bullets, which is where they killed folks. This is Ninth Fort, which was a military installation, which is where they actually had the killing site. There's memorials to those folks there. We also visited the Kaunas cemetery, and there are no headstones. They were all taken away and used for building material. So all that's left is this vast field that is where the cemetery stands. Our final site, really, for my Jewish ancestors was Varnia, which was pretty much off to the west, almost to the Baltic Sea. Varnia is where Katz's, Kreigers, and Khazan's from. Khazan was name of the Shenkers before they changed their name from Khazan to Shenker. This is on my mother's side of the family. This is in German-influenced part of Lithuania, kind of Prussian. But the people here are were a proud people. They were not Lithuanians, and they were not Germans, and they were not Scandinavians. They had their own little culture, and they took immaculate care of the cemetery in Varnia. And this building here was their city hall, and they actually used this as a concentration camp for the Jews before they were exterminated. As you can see, cemetery is well taken care of. There was a caretaker that was there working on the cemetery when we actually visited it. It was the best kept cemetery that I ran across in all of Ukraine, Lithuania. There was one other that was well taken care of, which was in the Zaidel, but I'm not going to go into that. And then we spent some time on the Baltic. We went to the beach. I went swimming in the Baltic. We went on a boat trip out in the bay. I saw sunrise over the dunes one day on a walk. It was a nice, pleasant, exciting trip. And then we headed back to Vilnius, and what do? We visited probably one of the most depressing concentration camps in Lithuania. It was part of East Prussia, what they called the southern and eastern part of Lithuania, because it was part of the Prussian Empire. This Oflag 53 concentration camp, the commandant for this concentration camp was sadistic. He didn't want to use bullets to kill Jews, so instead he built sand pits and threw people in there live. and let them suffocate, or he tied them to trees and set the trees on fire. Pretty depressing place to visit. And then finally, we ended our trip back in Vilnius. And wanted to share with you, I visited the synagogue there. They have about 200 families that go to services there. They have a memorial to the dead in Vilnius. This is the Jewish district of Vilnius. Galon of Vilnius was kind of the spiritual head of the Jewish community in all of Vilnius and Poland at the time. There were a lot of stones that were left at the site in Vilnius, where close to 74,000, I believe, Jews were killed. There were 11 different pits in Vilnius. They had the long, a couple of them were long trenches, but most of them were these circular pits that they kept intact so that we could remember the people who died. The cemetery in Vilnius, again, like the one in Kaunas, didn't have any headstones left, but they've been collecting all the headstones and bringing them to the site of the cemetery to figure out what to do. They built a memorial using some of the headstones, but there's parking lots full of the headstones that they've collected from throughout the city to try and figure out what to do with them. Cemeteries, I would love to spend some time to be able to go and help the cemetery. As you know, burial has always been considered by Jews as the greatest act of benevolence, and the care of the cemeteries is a social responsibility for all Jews. I really hope one day to be able to lead a cleanup of one or two of the cemeteries where my family have been buried. It's one of the things that I talked about with my sister that I want to be able to do on my next visit to Eastern Europe, is to try and organize a cemetery cleanup. Some other things that I found quite funny was there's this big giant Chinese takeout box in front of our hotel, which my sister called Jubate. And here's the hotel where we stayed. It was just kind of a interesting take on what things were, but this was smack in the middle of Lithuania. So I want to share with you that I did do a blog where I've captured a lot of the pictures and my thoughts as we went along, my sister's thoughts as we went throughout the trip. And I just need to let you know that this is a trip that every Jew must take. It's highly emotional, but extremely informative in helping you to understand the heritage and plight of the Ashkenazi Jews and the impact on all Jews of Europe. Thank you for your time.